just like make their way in. Oh, and there we go. Now we're official. Well, 5:03. That's pretty good. It's very on time for a Jewish event. I'm very proud of us.
That says a lot.
We're getting good. We're getting good at this.
You know what it is? It's no one has to deal with traffic.
That's true, especially in LA. Oh my God, do I remember that? Holy moly. You know, it's not good in Houston, but it's like relative. Because here it takes 15 minutes to get to Trader Joe's, and people are like, I'm not going. It's not worth it. But in LA, you can't get anywhere in 15 minutes.
Nowhere.
No, literally nowhere you can go in 15 minutes. It's not possible. 45-minute commute from AJU. And you're like, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a light commute.
It is. It doesn't give I got a straight shot. I like left early. It's ridiculous. Anyway, hi everybody. Everybody who is here and everyone else who is on their way. Come on down. Come on down when you come down. People will kind of file in, as one does. Welcome to the first of the two-part series, Gardening In and Outdoors. So today is the backyard and container gardening with Jewish farmer. It's always very exciting, and especially in LA, I think that's like a really Jewish farmer. In Houston, I actually do know a couple people who do farming and are Jews, but it is also very always interesting to meet Jewish farmers. So this is Nathan Looney. Nate, I met at AJU, the American Jewish University, when we were both in school there. Nate is the CEO and owner of Westside Urban Gardens. This is, now, not back when he was in school, which is an urban agricultural startup, which is based in Los Angeles, where Nate is currently, with all its terrible traffic, but probably not so terrible now, I imagine. Probably a lot better. He is, besides the CEO and owner of Westside Urban Gardens, a U.S. Army veteran. Thank you for your service. And an urban farmer, of course. So welcome, a nice, good Jewish boy who's a farmer also. And Nate can start today to teach us a little bit about backyard gardening and container gardening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We're the only ones who see the questions. So if you have any questions for Nate about anything that comes up, you can ask them in the chat. We will answer them, or he'll start to address them toward the end. So Nate, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rabbi Sarah. Thank you all for taking a little bit of time to learn about urban gardening and farming. A little bit about my background. I got into urban agriculture while I was a student at AJU and decided that, I was getting my degree in business, but didn't want to go the same route as everyone else, and saw that in the future, at the time we were in the middle of the drought in California, and I was like, well, we have to come up with new ways of cultivating food if the ways that we're currently doing it are becoming obsolete with time. So I got into controlled environment agriculture in particular because it enables me to bring food to cities and do it in the most efficient way possible. The side shoot of that is urban agriculture and container farming, container gardening. And that comes in many forms. So the way I'm going to do this session is a little bit of PowerPoint, a little bit of walking you through what urban agriculture is, what are some of the things that you need to be looking for. And then after that, I'm going to switch from this camera to another one and go over some examples of projects that you can create at home to keep kids engaged. One of the things that we're facing right now is we're all stuck in the house. If you don't have a backyard, it's nice to be able to do things to keep kids occupied. So what I'm going to do now is going to be sharing my screen. But before I switch into that, I want to take a second to talk about why it's important, why agriculture in particular is important at a time like this. There are two reasons, one of which being the fact that being able to grow your own food is one of the best skills that you could possibly have. It was mentioned that I'm a U.S. Army veteran. When I was in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, one of the things that I noticed is that the people that were able to fare best were the ones that were able to create resources on their own and share resources within their community. And so in a situation like this, where, I was in New York on March 13th, I, got back to Los Angeles March 14th, and there was no food in the grocery store. So the first thing I did was start growing food. But if you don't have that sort of skill, seeing something like that can be really alarming. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is there's just so much uncertainty that's around COVID-19, who's susceptible to it, who, you know, what the outcomes can be, what's going to happen with the economy. There's so many things that we can spend time being anxious and depressed about. Gardening and farming, I've found, have been the most therapeutic thing that I've incorporated in my life. As a U.S. Army veteran, I also have PTSD. And something that I realized when I started seeking the community of other veteran farmers is there are a lot of soldiers that come back from service and choose to get into agriculture just because of its therapeutic benefits. So I can't state that enough, that growing your own food has the ability to boost your morale, and it provides nutritious resources for you that you can either eat all at home, depending on how much space you have, or have enough for yourself and family members and greater community members. You know, there are many ways that this can look. So with that being said, I'm just going to switch gears and share my screen. Okay. All right. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about backyard farming and container gardening. So specifically, we're talking about soil-based farming. There are two different types of agricultural operations. There's soil-based and there's hydroponic and water-based. So today we're going to be focusing primarily on soil-based agriculture. So y'all are in the Houston area, so you're very familiar with the photo on the right side, which is a large-scale commercial tractor. That's actually my uncle and my dad on our family farm in Louisiana. But at the same time, you can have a soil-based operation in the middle of a city. On the left-hand side, that is a community garden that I built a few years back in South Central Los Angeles. It was a neighborhood where they realized that the closest grocery store was 2 miles away. Between that grocery store and where we built this garden, there were about 20 liquor stores or bodegas. So in this particular situation, they decided they wanted to, number one, find ways to support their own religious community with nutritious options, and also have fresh food options for the food pantry that they operated. So the urban farm can look very different. It's anything from your small backyard operation to your windowsill farm to a larger community garden. So the definition that I like to use for urban agriculture is it's agricultural cultivation in or near metropolitan centers. So the idea is that we're talking about local or hyper-local. So when we talk about local food, we're talking about under 35 miles, hyper-local being under 5 miles. So this could be, for me personally, I grow my food in my apartment. So my mileage, I'm talking feet. So from where I harvest my food to where I eat it is about 5 feet. So it's extremely hyper-local. So this can take the form of, like I said, the backyard garden. Now that can either look like an in-ground operation or raised beds, or it can just be pots, similar to this. Now, you can have balcony gardens if you have an apartment, but you only have like a patio or a balcony. There are things that you can do to cultivate food in that space. That's still considered urban farming. Window crops, if you've got a great bay window that gets light, you can use that for cut herbs, lettuces, things like that. And like I said, it can either be soil-based or hydroponic. And it can either be a personal garden or a commercial operation. Here in the LA area, there are quite a few commercial urban gardens. Most of those folks sell directly in the farmers markets. When I operated a commercial urban agricultural operation, I sold to restaurants and in the farmers markets. So just kind of giving you just a quick overview of what urban agriculture looks like. And like I said, there's a diversity of ways that can manifest. The first thing that you have to think about is sun exposure. If you're growing outdoors, where is the sun relative to where you plan to grow? So if you've got this great big backyard, but it's completely shaded in trees, yes, you might actually have a ton of square foot space to grow, but your crops may not thrive because they don't have direct sunlight. Something else to consider is sun positioning. So not only do you need to think about where the sun moves in the course of a day, you also have to think about where the sun is going to be on the horizon based on the time of year. So if you go out and look at your yard right now, the sun is going to be pretty close, closer to the horizon. We're getting closer to summertime, so we have more daylight. However, in the wintertime, the sun moves lower along the horizon. We have shorter days. And so you have to consider, depending on what you're planting, where is the sun going to be throughout the year? And if it's your home or your patio, well, where's the sun at first thing in the morning versus where is the sun in the evening? Something to think about is it's the ideal placement of your plant is south facing, because a south facing plant is going to get the most sunlight throughout the day. Doesn't mean that you can't grow things with other placement, but that is the most ideal way to grow crops. And if I'm scouting out a place to grow for someone else, the first thing I try to identify is where is the south facing best real estate to grow this crop. So even if you're operating where you've got a patio enclosure around your apartment, it just means finding the place on that patio that gets the majority of the sunlight throughout the day. Sometimes you have a spot that might just get really good sunlight the first 3 or 4 hours of the morning, and then the rest of the day, not so great. Or you might have a place that's shaded for the first 3 hours of the day, but then throughout the rest of the day, it's got great sunlight. I would opt for the place that's going to get the most sunlight throughout the day. Something else that's really important to think about is your skill level. Is this your first time growing something, or have you been dabbling around in the garden for years? So if you've been growing for years, you kind of have an idea of what the growth characteristics of different plants are, how much energy and effort it takes to have a successful crop. But if you've never grown before, you don't really have that idea, and it's very easy to be overambitious with starting up your garden. I always recommend starting small, learning how to grow, and then expanding, because if you do it the opposite way, it looks beautiful when you first started out, but the crop maintenance sort of gets ahead of you, and then it starts to look like a weed box, and then you kind of get disheartened by the whole process. So something else to consider is, yes, we're all at home right now. There's kids home, family members. You have tons of time to get out or garden at home in between Zoom calls. But what's going to happen to your garden when things return to what we call normal, or some semblance of normal, when you're actually going into your job every day and dropping kids off at school and soccer practice? So when you're building your operation now, you should factor that in of how much time do you have to devote to it now, and then being realistic about how much time you're going to have to devote to this after everything is said and done. And then also you want to consider your budget. Something that you can do is you can buy simple little containers and stick them on a patio. You can even cut a gallon water jug. It's one of my favorite repurposing activities, is to take a 1 gallon water jug, cut the top off of it, fill it with soil, or before you fill it with soil, take a nail and heat it up with a lighter or on the stove, poke a few holes in the bottom of that gallon jug, and now you've got a whole planter for free, pretty much, because the cost of it was the cost of the gallon of water. So you can do something that's nearly free, or you can build raised beds. Now, if you're building raised beds, you have to factor in the materials that you use for it. The most common material would be wood. The type of wood you use will determine how long that bed lasts. So your general redwood will probably give you about 2 years, 2.5 to 3 years before some of those the planks start to rot some. even longer than that, it'll still exist, but it's not going to have the same sort of look. Now, if you go up a step in cost, cedar wood tends to be the best wood for raised beds because it repels pests, and it's also a hardwood that's able to stand up to the elements. And then also you have to consider your irrigation. So if you're building, you know, say you build 6 beds in your yard, how are you going to irrigate that? Where's your garden hose tap at? How far is it from that tap line to where you're planning to build your garden? Or are you planning to water by hand? So these are some of the things that you have to think about. If you're setting up an irrigation system, do you have to call out a plumber in order to install that? Or if it's on the easier side of things, just getting a separate timer for your garden hose. So some of these things are the things that you need to think about. Now, if you're operating in your apartment and you don't have a yard to work with, well, then the budgeting can be a little bit different. You don't have to go the full spectrum when it comes to purchasing things. So in my personal system in the house, I grow inside of a grow tent and I use LED lights. Everybody doesn't have to grow that way. It's just the way that I personally grow because of my knowledge background, and it's also my test lab. But you don't need a $200 tent and a $200 light in order to cultivate crops in your house. You can buy a simple $30 light at Home Depot and build a structure to hold that light up with 2x4s or PVC pipe. So the spectrum of what it costs for you to set up one of these systems vary. You just have to set your budget for how much you're willing to spend on it. And then also something I like to think about is how much do you spend on produce and how much are you expecting to get from this garden for produce? Are you looking at this just as a hobby thing, or are you looking at it to supplement the food that you're growing at home? So these are some of the things that you have to factor in as you're deciding where you're going to grow. So the next question is, what are you going to grow? So y'all are in the Houston area. There's something called the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone. And when you look up the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone, what it does is it asks you to put in your zip code, and it'll tell you exactly which crops are best suited for your personal climate based on your zip code. And it's really in depth. I use it all the time here in LA, and there's been times where one zip code 10 minutes down the road has had a different hardiness zone than another zip code. So it takes into account humidity, elevation, rain levels, freezes. If you live somewhere that actually freezes in the winter, all of these things are factored in. And I find that to be the best resource for starting to figure out what's possible to grow. So the next thing that you would want to do from that list is figure out what it is that you actually are capable of growing based on that list. So here in Southern California, I can pretty much grow just about anything, but that doesn't mean that I want to grow just about anything. If I'm growing in a backyard and I only have a limited amount of space, sure, you know, the two pots that I have, I could grow a watermelon plant and a lettuce head. Well, that one lettuce head, once I've harvested that lettuce head, that's all I'm going to get. So I've used up my real estate for, 35 to 42 days to grow that one head of lettuce, when perhaps I could have grown some cucumbers and constantly been harvesting cucumbers. Cucumbers tend to be really easy to grow. And once the plant gets established, it's producing cucumbers every day to every 2 days. So it's one of those really good plants to get in the ground, and it'll always produce. One of my personal favorites, because I'm a big fan of Israeli salad, and so to be able to have all of my ingredients minus I don't know, the green onions growing, it's really nice. So the next thing that you want to think about is, after you've gone through your list of what's possible to grow, what your family actually eats, then you want to figure out how you want to grow. So do you want to start from seed, or do you want to start from a plant that you buy in the store? So if you want to start from seed, you need to factor in the growth characteristics of that plant. Some plants prefer less water during the germination process. Some require more water. Some plants will germinate within 5 days. Some crops need 11 to 14 days before you start seeing any sort of action with the seed. So you have to tack that on to the time before you actually get the plant. So there's a difference between fruiting crops and leafy greens. So a leafy green, from the time you put the seed in the ground to the time that you're actually harvesting from it, it's about 35 days for baby sized crops. Now, if you're doing a tomato in the ground, a tomato is going to take, from seed, it's probably going to take you about 6 weeks before you start to see the blossoms on it. And that's not even your fruit, that's just your blossoms. So if you're, like right now we're in May, so it's a little bit late into the season, I would lean towards purchasing starter plants if you're doing something with a fruiting crop, so that way you can get a jump on the season. But starting from seed, that's the way I personally grow. I enjoy it. There are many ways to do that. At the end towards the end, I'm going to go over some different lessons or activities for kids. And one of those lessons is related to germinating seeds and how you do that. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Something else to consider is your crop planting density. The way the size of the crops when you start are not what they're going to be when they are fully mature. One of the easiest mistakes is with tomatoes, because the tomato plant, when you get it from the nursery, it's like small, it's cute, and then you get it in really good soil and you're giving it sun and water, and then it just explodes. But when you were at the nursery, you bought 6 tomato plants for 4 square feet of space, and they all fit perfectly when you first planted them. But as they matured, there just isn't enough space, and you have a situation where the plants are competing for nutrients and space, so you actually get less produce because they aren't able to thrive individually. So there are several garden design apps that are out there that can assist you with mapping out your garden. I personally haven't come across one that's free that I really appreciate yet, but they do exist. The paid ones aren't too expensive. I think there's some that start like in the $12, $15 range, and then they go all the way up for a professional grade software. A concept that I like to teach people when I'm teaching backyard gardening is square foot gardening. It's a really easy way to space out your garden box. So if you're using a raised garden bed and it's a 3 foot by 2 foot garden bed, what you can do is measure out 1 square foot, and I like to take like a nail and twine and go from one end of the bed to the other at the 1 foot spot, and then again at 2 feet, and then in the opposite direction I do the same thing and create a matrix. And so when you look down on it, you see you see the squares of your box. And then that allows you to plant within those squares. So some crops require 1 square foot per plant. Some crops require 3 to 4 square feet per plant. So as you're deciding what you're going to grow, you can sort of figure out based on how much space you have what you can grow. Something that's really good with limited spaces, carrots are great. Sometimes if you're doing it in containers, like in actual like potted plants, make sure that you choose a carrot variety that's suited for that. Longer carrots won't thrive if they don't have the space for their taproot to move down. Another crop that's really fast and easy to grow, radishes. Radishes are from the time you put them in the ground till the time they pop. If the weather's above room temperature, they're gonna pop within 5 days. You're probably gonna have radishes in 3 weeks. Cool thing about radishes is if you plant a new row every week you've got radishes, if you like radishes. I'm not the biggest radish fan, so it's not something that I personally grow a lot of, but radishes are another option. And then if you choose to not go with actual crops, the photo on the left side is of microgreens. So microgreens are the earliest stage of a crop. And if you're really, really limited in space, 1 tray of microgreens, a tray is 10 inches by 22 inches, by 20 inches, excuse me. So 10 inches by 20 inches is about all the space you need in order to grow a tray of microgreens. So what you grow is going to be determined by how much space you have, how much time you're willing to commit to the garden, where you live, and how much you're willing to spend on setting it up. So as I was talking about earlier with budget, it's important to think about how you're going to get water to your garden. Are you planning to just use some pots and do pour over irrigation? And if that's the case, it's good to have a pot that has drainage on it. If the pot doesn't have drainage, you run the risk of getting something called pythium, also known as root rot. So I personally appreciate timed watering systems because you don't have to think about it. It just comes on. Specifically, if you've got a sprinkler system already set up in your yard, it's a very simple adjustment to have your gardener come out and install a drip line in your system. All they would do is either tap into one of the valves or remove one of your sprinkler heads and swap that out for a drip attachment and run that to your system. So between drip irrigation and sprinkler systems are great in certain environments, but you end up wasting water. And then in addition to that, some crops do not thrive if they get their leaves wet, depending on the time of year. So your squashes don't like having their leaves wet. They're very susceptible to something called powdery mildew, especially from about now all through summer. Powdery mildew is just a thing that you have to battle with squash plants. So if you're introducing water to the leaves more than you should, you're going to have more powdery mildew that you're going to have to deal with. Specifically, if you're working with lettuces, depending on the time of day when your irrigation system goes off, if it's a sprinkler system, that water on the leaves can literally cook your plant during the day. So, it's really important to think about how you're watering, where the water is coming from, where the water is going on the plant. Drip systems are super easy to install. I find them to be pretty much reliable. There's a little bit of adjustments that have to happen depending on the type of system you use. Netafim is a Israeli company that sells drip hoses with emitter holes in them already. So that's an option, and then you just plant along where those holes are. I tend to use the solid type drip lines. It's a 1/2 inch drip line as my main line, and then I use the 1/4 inch to put emitters directly on the plant. And what I tend to do is the emitter that I put for the plant is specific to that type of plant. So if I'm trying to irrigate a tomato plant, then I'm going to go with something that emits water at 2 gallons per hour. If it's just a simple herb like a sage or something like that, I might go down to a half gallon per hour drip emitter. So it just depends on where you want to start. And it's totally not necessary to fine tune your irrigation your first time out. Also, you can use a garden hose timer. Lowe's sells the Y adapter for your hose spigot. You screw that on, you have one line going to your regular garden hose. On the other side of that, you put a timer and set your drip system to it, and you can just kind of hands off with that. Now, the other question about how to grow and what you're growing is, what are your predators? What are the things that are going to eat the food that you're beautifully growing? Are there raccoons in your area? Do you have deer, squirrel? Are there humans? Like, how much are your kids going to be around the garden? How much awareness do they have of the delicacy of what you're growing? So these are some of the things that you should consider. One of the things is if you've got deer, putting up some sort of deer fencing around is going to be really important. Squirrels, unfortunately, they're really hard to deal with. With that, it's usually better to put down something like on the soil to prevent them from getting on it. There's something that they sell at Home Depot, I believe it's called Ritter, and it comes in a shake bottle. It's a blue shake bottle, and you shake it around your plants, and it's got like black pepper and red pepper in it. And I've found that that's pretty good at keeping squirrels away. Certain times of year, we get grubs out here in the soil, and the raccoons aren't really digging up your plant. They're just digging up the soil to get to the grubs, but in the process of that, they're digging up all your plants. So that's something to think about, is like, what are the things that are going to eat your food, and how can you work around that? And I find that, YouTube is really great when I'm trying to solve something simple, like a small solution specific to an area, because there's someone else out there that's made that video. Something to think about is your pest management. Depending on all crops have some sort of pest. If your crops don't have pests, that means that not even the bugs want what you're growing. So there's something wrong with what you're growing. So pests aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're a nuisance, but they're not bad. They show you that you're doing something right. So something that a lot of us in the agricultural industry use is something called integrative pest management. What that means is, how can I limit my pest exposure with using the least amount of pesticides possible? So that could be companion planting. So if I plant a tomato plant, then I'm going to want to plant basil all around the base of the plant, because that's going to limit how much the pests actually get on the plant, because they're deterred by the basil. If I'm growing, a row of lettuces, I might plant lemongrass on the ends of it, because that's a natural pesticide, and it'll limit. It won't completely keep them out, but it will limit the amount of pests in your actual system. And by pests, I mean insects. So there's that. And then also there's seasonal pests. Certain times of year, like I mentioned before with the powdery mildew, it's going to come back. It's going to happen. If you accept that it's going to happen, then you can deal with it and move on. And the best way to deal with that is with something called horticultural oil. It comes in a concentrated form, and you just mix it with water, put it in a spray bottle, and spray down the infected areas or remove the dead leaves. So that's an easy fix for that. Also, aphids. Aphids are the #1 pest that everyone has to deal with. And the reason why they're so bad is because they reproduce prolifically. An aphid is born pregnant, and I believe it's able to produce something like 400 to 500 babies in the first 10 days of its life. So if you see one aphid, you're going to have exponential growth in days. So it's really important to jump on top of that and take care of those, and also accept that it's going to happen. There's certain crops that are more susceptible to aphids. Your brassicas, so that's your cauliflower, your kales, what are they called? Brussels sprouts are notorious for aphids. I often try to steer people away from growing Brussels sprouts, because so much time is spent fighting aphids that the crop's not even worth eating after everything's done, because you're so upset because you spent a month and a half fighting off these bugs. So that's something else to think about related to that. So 1 second, I'm going to close out of this and switch back. One second, just opening up my screen back. Okay. Oh, we're good on time. Excellent. So now I'm going to switch off of this camera, and I'm going to switch to another camera, and we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do to create projects around the house for kids. In particular, around this time, there's still STEM requirements that it's hard to meet just with a camera, but if you can actually be hands-on, or if the kids can be hands-on, these are really great tools. For myself, I realized that I understood physics and geometry a whole lot better when I started designing and building my own systems. And I think that can also translate to kids in that once you make this sort of stuff accessible to them, there's a spark that's created. So I'm going to switch off of this camera, and then I'll switch to my other one. Okay. All right. So the sun moved. So the thing that I like to do, the first thing that I want to highlight is a grow log. Actually, no. Before I do the grow log, I'm going to take a step back. Germination. So this is, some of us may have done this in elementary school. You take a couple of seeds and you put a paper towel in and a little bit of water, and you watch the plant grow. These seeds in particular were intended to be some cucumber plants that I wanted to put in my system, and they were old seeds. So seeds actually have a expiration date on them. And these seeds were old, and I was like, I'm just going to try it and see if they'll germinate. Unfortunately, they haven't germinated. Particularly cucumbers will germinate within the first 5 days, and I did this about a week ago. I gave it a few extra days just to see if it would come through, but it didn't. But this is a really good exercise for kids, because not only do they get to see the initial growth stages of the plant, it also familiarizes them with the biology of the plant. So you can sort of do spin-off exercises around drawing what they're seeing each day of the plant growth. You can do dissections. So maybe instead of just growing, doing one seed, they do 3. And at a certain point in the crop, in the seed growth, they take it out and take it apart and describe what they see. If they're a little bit more advanced, if they're an older student, you can have them do a research project on it and go online and define the different parts of the plant or the different parts of the seed, like the taproot, the actual root body, the root hairs. So there are tons of assignments that you can come up with for this. And so that leads me into this actually. This is actually the grow log, my lab grow log. I don't necessarily use a handwritten one anymore, but this is the one that I used for several years. And so what it looks like is actually writing in everything that goes on with the plant. So I've used this at different stages. This particular time period, and it's better to show you the actual writing of it than put it in a PowerPoint, because I want to make this tangible. So when I was talking about hydroponic growing, there's also something called aquaponics. And when you're starting that sort of system, each day there's biological changes in the water. And so what I did is I created this log that I would write in every day what the fluctuations in the system were. So this is for kids, it doesn't have to be as intense as what this is, but still that's something where every day they write 1 or 2 sentences about what they're seeing going on with that seedling. Or if the seedling makes it into soil and starts to thrive, then they can actually do something related to that. So what that can look like, this is a pea plant that I started April 1st for my hydroponic system. And so what you could do is you can have them draw something like this, where they're actually just identifying what the root systems look like. I have this ruler in here. They can measure the length of the roots. And the way that you would create something like this would be with a mason jar. You can just do this with a mason jar, and these netting cups, they sell them on Amazon. They're called hydroponic netting cups. They're super, super cheap. And so this would be a good example of something that you can do as a simple in-home project, and it doesn't take up a lot of space. If you can put it in like a kitchen window, someplace that it's getting good light, it works as a great long-term experiment. The last one that I want to share with you before we switch to questions is transplanting a plant. So kids like to get their hands dirty. At least some kids do. So transplanting a plant is a really easy task. So you put enough soil in there to raise up the level so the roots aren't just touching the bottom. And I'm actually just going to transplant this guy in here. So ideally, when you get it from the store, you would have imagined this all being soil and not a netting cup. But you literally, what you want to do, just make a little hole in there. Set your roots down in, and then add soil around it. Be careful to not damage your root system too much in the process, because all plants will go through a little bit of a root shock when you transplant them. So they're gonna show a little bit of distress, but not, generally not too much distress. So you just want to be a little, handle your roots gingerly. And then after that, a little bit of water around it to make sure everything's all saturated. Ideally, what I like to do is make sure that it's watered until it's running out and draining. And then I know I've got enough water there, and that's it. So with that, I'm going to switch back to my other computer, and I am happy to answer your questions. So give me one. Okay.
Hooray.
All right. So.
All right. Thank you, first of all, for so much good information. Oh, man. I'm going to grow some radishes. I love radishes, so I'm very excited about that information.
Yes.
We got some good questions. And, of course, you can keep asking questions. They're almost all texted to me, so that's really funny. Okay. Despite the private chat. But yeah, people can keep texting or whatnot to get your questions in. Okay, I'm going to put that down. We're going to try and get through as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. First question is, someone said, I started some beet seeds in a shallow little indoor greenhouse type thing. It's a direct quote. They're doing great, but when do I know when to transfer them?
So oftentimes beets do really well if they're direct seeded and not started indoors. But they can be transferred once they're first true leaves. So you have, when a plant first comes up, you get the first leaves that come up out of the seed. And those are what we refer to as like the microgreen sort of stage. The next leaves that come out that resemble the actual leaf of the plant are what we call the true leaves. So once you have your first set of true leaves that are fully mature, then you can start, or at least at the baby stage. Actually, I can show you what I mean. Perk of a hydroponic system in my house. So this is a chard plant, but chard and beets are about the same in their growth characteristics. So once the crop is about this size, it's good to go for transplanting. And so what I mean by the true leaves, these are the actual true leaves. The baby leaves, if you can see them, are these little tiny leaves down here that are about to fall off. Little tiny leaves down there. So based on what you're seeing here, if this looks anything similar to what you have going on as far as the size of it goes, then they're ready to go on the ground. This is about 2.5 inches of actual plant.
Wow. Okay, there's like much more questions coming. This is good. This is good. This is good. I have a 3-year-old who wants to help, but he is a destructive whirlwind of a human being. What can I plant, or how can I plant it that he will not destroy it in his enthusiasm?
That's a good question. I can tell you what to stay away from to start from there.
That's good.
I would stay away from lettuces. I mean, don't not grow lettuces, but if you want to do something with your son, blueberries. A blueberry bush is something that's really good. It's not always going to produce all year round, but it's a pretty sturdy plant. I won't say it's completely toddler proof, but it would last. Strawberries. The thing about strawberries is they're invasive, so make sure you find a way to keep the roots in one place. But because they're invasive, they're a very resilient plant. And so even if he happens to destroy a portion of the plant, it'll come back. So that's something that I would think of. I would also maybe do like a tomato plant. Maybe be a little careful and gingerly around it in the earlier stages of growth. But as the plant gets bigger, good luck tearing it up.
That's good. That's important. Any farmers groups you suggest for beginners from the many available online?
Not farmers groups for beginners farmers, but community that I'm a part of is the, I believe it's the Jewish Farmer Network on Facebook. So it's on Facebook, and they actually had their first in-person conference this past February at Pearlstone in Maryland, and the conference actually sold out. So there's a lot more Jewish farmers in the world than we perceive there to be. So I would lean towards that, because right now there's a lot of really good introductory programming coming down the pipeline. So that's one area that I would look into. Depending on your age, I'm a part of an organization called National Young Farmers Coalition. That's geared more towards people that are looking to get in commercial agriculture, but they also do a lot of work around urban agriculture and urban gardens and urban farming. And so there's a lot of resources that can come from that if you're under the age of 40. Obviously, we don't completely exclude anyone over the age of 40, but that's just kind of the general dividing line. So that's another thing. Also, something that I've found that's been really helpful is if people make their own groups of friends. If their friends if you have family members or friends that also want to grow, that communal knowledge will be really helpful, because if you're all learning at the same time, it's a really, really fun experience.
That's true. Okay, you're my child being very loud there. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry. How bad is it to grow things outside your USDA area?
It's not. It's not. It's either going to grow or it won't.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, true.
That's really what it comes down to. And even though I'm a farmer, I look at myself as more of a scientist. So I'm always experimenting with things that, growing things at times of the year where I shouldn't be growing them. Specifically corn. Corn has a certain season, but it's a geothermological plant, which means that it receives its nutrients and it's heated through the soil. So I was like, well, if we're dealing with climate change and global warming in California, why can't I grow corn in the middle of fall? So these are guidelines, but if it doesn't grow, then that's not the month that it'll work in your area, or it could just be the seed. But I would still try.
That's good. I like that. That's fair. Like, yeah, give it a shot. See what happens. Either grows or it doesn't grow. I like that. What are herbs we can grow in our climate? So this person wants to start an herb garden on their balcony, and they want to know where to start. And do you have suggestions on a kit specifically?
So it's hard to say for every specific area. So I always use the USDA hardiness zone guide. But if you want to just do a simple herb garden on your balcony, Amazon actually sells herb kits. If you are personally not shopping with Amazon right now, the local hardware store also has these grow kits. And usually the best ones to grow are basil. Parsley tends to be a little bit more challenging to get started if you start it from seed, but I really enjoy growing parsley. Mint is another great one to grow. But once again, be careful with mint because it's invasive. So if it gets in the ground, good luck getting rid of it. So those would be the three that I would grow. Think about what is it that you like to eat on a day-to-day basis, and then grow those things.
There you go. I like that. Is germination in a tissue and a plastic bag better than growing pellets?
Oh, no. This is what I generally use for germination. Actually, it looks like this. It's a full tray, and I actually set this tray on a heating mat. They sell agricultural heating mats online, and that's how I actually cultivate most of my or do my germination. Yeah. The paper towel and Ziploc is more for visuals than what's best.
But good for kids to see what germination looks like. Maybe not for if you're actually trying to grow something for food.
Yeah, because what actually ends up happening is when it's time to take that root and seed off of the paper towel, if you're not really delicate with it, you can end up damaging the whole thing before you even get started.
Okay, good to know. Are there good microgreen seeds for soil?
So all microgreen seeds are best with soil. So you can use synthetic medium to grow microgreens, like they make felt pads. You can use paper towels. There's something called hemp. There's hemp sheets that you can use. But ideally, microgreens grow best. All microgreens grow best in soil. When I was cultivating commercially, I was using soil in my system. So, good thick layer of soil. If you're using a 10-20 tray, just, make sure you've got a little bit of space for you to have room to cut when you harvest off your crops. But I vote for soil. I've done all the different growing varieties, but I find soil to be the most stable. If you use paper towels, what happens if you forget to water one day is that your whole crop dries out and dies. If you forget to water one day with soil, it's a lot more forgiving because there's moisture held in it.
And are there certain kinds of seeds that work better? Or is it just like all microgreen seeds in general just better in soil?
All microgreens seeds in general are better in soil. Now, the only thing that would be different is the type of microgreens. So if you're doing something like a radish, you would broadcast the seeds on top of the soil, and then the microgreens will grow up from there. If you're growing something like speckled pea shoots or any sort of a pea shoot, you need to cover the seeds with about like a centimeter of soil. Same thing with sunflowers. For sunflower shoots, sunflowers actually need to push up on something in order to grow. So if there's no soil, if they don't have that soil layer, it's not going to grow. Also cilantro, I know that's a big microgreen favorite. Some people think it tastes like soap, but
I'm doing a big thumbs down for everybody who can't see. So
that's one of the most expensive microgreens to grow.
Another reason not to eat it.
Yeah, they're great, but they're good on fish tacos, in my opinion. So if you're doing cilantro or something like that, that's going to need a little bit of soil. There are some specialty crops that you have to be a little bit more delicate with. In particular, if you're doing red shiso, which is an Asian specialty green, it doesn't perform as well in soil, so you have to use another type of medium, and I'm blanking on what it's called. It's one of the additives that I use. I'm blanking on what it's called, but something like that. If it's a very, very specialized crop, and always just start with soil. And if the crops don't come up, try again. And if that happens again, then try to like change something up. Also, seeds have, like I said, they have an expiration date. And most seed packaging, if you get it from Johnny's Seeds, their organic producer, those seeds have an germination rate on them. So it'll say on the package, for every 100 seeds, X amount of these seeds are going to pop. Generally, it's between 92 to 99%. But if you have some seeds and none of it pops and you've used the whole container of seeds, you can actually contact the seed company and say, hey, I think the germination rate on these seeds were bad, and they'll send you more.
Wow, this is good information. You are worth every penny. This is great. Fruits and veggies, just to round us out, we have a couple more questions. Fruits and veggies that have a high success rate on balconies, growing in balconies.
Fruits and veggies that have a high success rate on balconies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to depend on your light exposure.
Oh, sorry, well-lit balconies. Well-lit balconies for beginners. There are many, many adjectives that well-lit balconies for beginners, fruits and veggies.
Okay, so well-lit, that was going to be my first thing, is light exposure. So we've got good light exposure. Balcony gardening, I would go with cucumbers. I would go with tomatoes. And don't do too many tomato plants. You just need like maybe 1 or 2 because it's going to get big. A cherry tomato plant, if you let it go and thrive, it's going to get 14 feet high and spread out. But obviously you don't want to use that much space. So I would do, like I said, the tomatoes. I would do cucumbers. As far as fruiting vegetables go, stay away from things like squash because it's going to need too much space. A squash plant is just going to take up too much square footage per plant. and just take over your whole area. As far as fruits go, if you can do like a simple citrus tree, that's nice because that's not that big of a planter, but it'll be something that'll produce. Also, strawberries are really forgiving. Blueberries are another easy starter plant. Sometimes people try to start with raspberries, but it takes raspberries a good amount of time to get established. So you might be like 3 years in and still only seeing like one raspberry. Whereas with blueberries, I've transplanted blueberries and that next season had a full harvest. Kumquats, it's a small tree. If you like kumquats, that's another good one. So those are some of the ones that I would start with. I would limit how much space you use for full heads of lettuce. So there's something called cut and come again lettuces. Those are lettuces where you can cut some of the leaves off and let the plant continue to grow and keep producing. So you just take off what you need for your salad for the night, and then the plant will keep going versus having just one head of lettuce in a pot. And, like I said before, 45 days later, you cut that one head of lettuce off, and now you got to start all over again. Cut and come again lettuces. My favorite to grow in that situation is arugula. I'm a huge wild arugula fan, and it'll just keep coming back.
That's great. I guess the last question before we say not our goodbyes, but our see you next week is, this is going to be tough because this is why I moved to my new office because I had 4 windows in there. So I'm actually growing stuff in my new office, not that I'm in there anymore. But we have the question of good plants for windowless offices.
Windowless offices.
Just throw you a real curveball at the end, just to make it really hard.
It's not that hard because my background is in controlled environments.
I've killed every plant I've ever had in an office with windows, and so maybe that's why I think it's really hard because everything's died.
Amazon LED light.
We're good.
Amazon sells small LED lights for growing crops, and I think they're pretty cheap, like 30 or 40 bucks. They're not too expensive, and if you have a plant in an office, that would work for having that plant thrive. Ideally, the fluorescents are bright enough, but it's the distance from the plant to the fluorescent, in an office building, and that's why it's not able to grow. So if that same fluorescent light was only about 2 feet away from the plant would explode and thrive. But it's the light saturation that makes it down to the plant. It's not strong enough to create the photosynthesis that's needed for the plant to thrive.
Good to know. All right. Well, the last thing someone actually messaged in was to thank you again for your service, and thank you for your services tonight. This is amazing. This is great information on backyard and container gardening. So thank you to Nate for being just some great information. Thank you so much. We're getting lots of little clappies, hands and such, which is really exciting. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Cool. So if you enjoyed this and you're like, I really do want to grow stuff, but I want to grow stuff indoors. That's what you're covering, I believe, next week, right?
Yes. So next week we'll be specifically talking about hydroponics. Some of the ins and outs of how to set up a hydroponic system. I'll take you all through a little bit of a tour of my personal grow system that I have here at the house. And same sort of thing is at the end, I'll definitely answer questions. And, thank you to Rabbi Sarah Fort for inviting me to share my knowledge with you all. And I'm really grateful to have this knowledge to share in such a crazy time.
Yes, and we are grateful to have a wonderful Jewish farmer accessible to us with such great information. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight, and thank you to Nate for coming and being with us, and we will see you, and hopefully all of you, next week. So everybody stay safe and be well.
Bye.
Bye.